Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to Spooky Week. Today we are going to be creating a sort of skeleton gem makeup tutorial. Now don't mind how I look right now because I did a makeup tutorial yesterday and the pink that I used from yesterday's video stained my eyelids pink, and I have really bad allergies, so that's why I look all congested and why my eyelids are pink. So we are just gonna hop into this video. I am gonna do a voiceover as usual for my makeup videos. If you guys want to watch the rest of the Spooky Week videos, if you missed them, those will all be down below in the description or in the top corner. And I always get it wrong, so it's probably that corner. So let's just hop into this video.
Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today for this voiceover, I thought because this is the last day of Spooky Week and because this is Halloween, I thought instead of doing my normal voiceover, we would do a creepypasta story. So for those of you who don't know what creepypasta is, it is a website where people can post their creepy stories. Now this is up all year round, but specifically during Halloween time, people post some really good ones. So I found one on the website that we're going to read. Now please bear with me, I am not the greatest at reading out loud. So let us get started. Now, the story I'm going to be reading is called Out in the Woods. Alright, let's go. Hey, just thought that I would share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, in a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day long. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of the time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way up to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further. And I had a bad habit of freaking out of how high up I was. One day I was sitting in my usual spot in the fallen tree, which was just a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when suddenly I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed shock in me. Hey kid. I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come directly from underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon too convinced that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. I know you can hear me. His voice was much louder this time. As I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher, trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The bird's song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud, as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip into the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved by only grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, much after, worried, searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive, hard skin of a child, although I thought I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking the firewood from the shed out back, which was just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you've never seen a barn owl's face staring right at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed may be. One of these nights, it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling very disoriented, and more than once I walked into the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurking forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all the wood I was bundling into my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house, since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting to be pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions trying to figure out my position in the mists, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I was wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was ripped out of square pink paper. On it there was an arrow pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mom might make, I rationalized to keep me from getting lost. So, foolishly, I followed the direction set by the green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small sloppily written note that said this way. Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out the mist to feel for trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked out to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against a pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins of my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance, squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh without any sign of decay despite the previous week's non-stop rain. I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently wobbling in them in fear. My ears were sensitive to a tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading that horrible note over and over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused a sprint blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain mist lapped the back of my neck like the decaying breath of something running behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bottled indoors and quickly crawled into bed, where I remained. Unsleeping till morning, Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't gone through to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at the damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until she had never experienced any of the strange things that I had, although we mutually shared a peculiar, oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us, and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year at high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, we're about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at the point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from my mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself, is what a prank?" Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" in all caps. Of course I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until about 3 a.m. when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning, and to not by any means dare go home. I remember those bleak torrents of the rain in the day that I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I'd had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of a composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all the color drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing into the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear it would horrify her superstition soul too much. This is what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, as she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open, the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping noises near her head. At a window. When she went over to investigate, she saw a fat brown moth of some kind we often got at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work. However, feeling a little rattled in some way, it was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush and then fall into the arc, bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where the heavy ones had hit, right beside her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness, enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing, half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely stifled a scream. Seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush. As they continued to do so in the loud downpour, my face unceasingly continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence the text later, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me, behind the tree, just started moving as if it were mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree. My mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless, black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working log, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of my bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distant, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up in the closet door where an awful white face could be staring right at her, mouth contouring and gaping in what sounded like highly sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock. Bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart a spray of glass shards, before finally getting out, running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said that as she glanced back, right at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her car got further and further away from our house. This would be final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she says she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, only two things left worth mentioning. 1. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including the one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed with rocks and were lying on the floor. 2. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we'd swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that the weeks since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches out of the old pine tree over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing on many years ago. It was obviously new rope and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable. Said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course he knew as well that I did. We had literally no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go and was pleased enough to just say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder, though. It's been long enough and no longer I feel scared about talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. Seeing as it is Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family that had been a young couple and their little son shortly after we moved out. Despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty, now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obliviously towards it. Okay guys, that is the end of this creepypasta. Hopefully my reading wasn't too terribly horrific. I have never been the greatest at reading out loud, especially not stories like that. I fumble on my words a lot, so hopefully it was decent enough to listen to. It was actually kind of creepy as I was reading it. I hadn't read it before this, so I'm definitely gonna need to watch some Friends after this, because that was definitely a little bit creepy. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm currently finishing up the makeup look here, as you can see. If you guys want to see more videos like this where I read a creepypasta, I will try to get better at reading out loud and not be complete trash at it like I am now. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed Spooky Week. Today is the last day of Spooky Week, sad face. This year I had a lot of fun with this, so I'm really proud and I'm really happy with how the Spooky Week turned out. If you guys are enjoying it, please let me know down below in the comments. Be sure to leave this video a thumbs up. If you want to, stay behind for the outro, and stay for the very end for some bloopers. If you guys recreate any of my looks, please tag me on social media. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys in the next video.
Okay guys, that is the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm like so happy with how this turned out. I don't really want to wash it off. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. Today is the last day of Spooky Week. I hope you guys enjoyed the Spooky Week. If you did, please be sure to let me know down below in the comments and leave this video a thumbs up. If you guys want to see my future uploads, please go down below and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you get a notification every time I upload a new video. I hope you guys are having a wonderful Halloween. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun this year with Spooky Week. Anyways, I'm gonna go. I love you guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. I look so tired. Ugh. Let's get started, shall we? We are starting to get low on this.